So President Trump is now saying that we should ban Twitter. And you have Rand Paul, who's doing an exodus from big tech, and he's starting with YouTube. So let me go ahead and throw this up there for everybody to take a look. This is tweeted by Rumble. Breaking news. Quote, this is from a Washington Examiner piece with Rand Paul. So today I announced that I will begin an exodus from big tech. I will no longer post videos on YouTube unless it is to criticize them or announce that viewers can see my content on rumble.com. So, I read his piece, and look, there are parts of it that I agree with. He says, I cited a study where cloth masks are much less effective than surgical masks, and surgical masks are much less effective than KN95 masks, and the N95 masks are much more effective than the KN95 masks. So there's a hierarchy of masks in the same way that we now know there's like a hierarchy of the vaccines, Johnson & Johnson being the least effective, and then Pfizer being the second, Moderna being the most effective. So he made that point, and whatever video he talked about that in, it was axed. The other thing is, criticism of Dr. Fauci has been either censored or held back in the algorithm. The original idea of, hey, this may have came from a Wuhan lab, that at one point that was considered flat out misinformation. And I think Rand Paul may have been banned from one platform or another for floating that idea. And he's like, well, now we know that's not crazy. And it is true that that's actually probably the more likely scenario. We don't know for sure, but Jon Stewart was joking about this on Stephen Colbert's show. He's like, dude, we have basically the Wuhan Bat Coronavirus Research Center that right there in Wuhan, and people are acting like it's insane that a bat coronavirus may have come from there. So the idea that you ban this or you can't talk about it is insane. Now, I will say, Rand Paul, he's a little more slippery than he'd like to admit. So in other words, oftentimes he takes his opinions on this and he goes way overboard. So he'll be way more conclusive. So in other words, instead of saying what I just said, hey, cloth masks work the worst, but there's still some semblance of protection, then surgical, then N95 are the best. Instead of like saying, hey, there's a hierarchy, these ones are better than these ones, he would just summarize that as masks don't work. Okay, well then I think there is a fair claim that you're doing misinformation, or at the very least saying something that's misleading. Now, but where him and I agree is, no, I don't think you should be banned for saying that. And if you're going to ban that under the guise of, well, this is COVID misinformation, well, then YouTube, you better get to work, totally eliminating every single video from Fauci early on in the pandemic when he said masks don't work. Because there's that famous video where he said early on in the pandemic, you don't need to go around wearing a mask everywhere. That's overboard. Then eventually that changed. And there's a number of claims. I mean, the CDC and the World Health Organization and the FDA, like all of these official government bodies, every step of the way in the pandemic, instead of being like, hey, we don't know about X, Y, or Z yet, they would just say whatever their thoughts were at the time, and oftentimes they would just be dead wrong. So if you're going to start banning coronavirus misinformation, then you got to ban that stuff. And let's be clear, there's also misinformation on the other side of this. There are people who've gotten the vaccine and gotten boosted, but they functionally act like the vaccine doesn't work. Or sometimes they just flat out say it. And so, in other words, there are overcautious liberals who sort of spread misinformation as well. But my guess is they won't ban them because they're erring more on the side of caution and erring more on the side of the liberal side of this debate. So they sort of get a pass. So in a sense, I understand what Rand Paul is saying here. But the fact of the matter is, he's wrong that on what the solution is. So in his piece, he lays out, listen, I understand that when it comes to free speech, that's just the government cannot prosecute you for your speech. The government cannot suppress your political speech. Private company can do whatever they want with my stuff. So that's why I'm going to these other platforms. See, on that front, I go, you're wrong, Rand, because my solution isn't the capitalist libertarian response of, hey, private property is private property and they can do whatever they want. No. I think the reality is all of the big social media outlets today are effectively the new public square. And since that's the case, you should regulate them as if they're public utilities, expand First Amendment protections, and allow free speech to flourish. Now, that doesn't mean you could do doxing, direct threats of violence, targeted harassment, libel, slander. All that stuff is still going to be illegal. But at least we would know what the clear rules are, and there wouldn't be any targeting for just false information or for, political disagreements. And so, in a weird way, I will say this, at least he's being consistent with his libertarian philosophy, where he's like, no, private company is a private company, they can do what they want. But I'm not, a right-wing libertarian. I'm a leftist. And my answer is to regulate them as if they're public utilities. So I think he's wrong on that. And I also think he's wrong on this notion that you can build an effective alternative. It's like, in theory, sure, but in theory, RC Cola can knock Coca-Cola and Pepsi off the top spot. Is it actually going to happen? No. So you go to where the audience is, and the entire audience now is on Facebook, on Twitter, on Insta, on YouTube. Like, that's where the people are. So if you think, well, we'll just have this startup and knock the kings off their throne, not like it hasn't been tried before. There's been a number of video websites that have tried to do a YouTube thing, and it didn't work out. There's a number of sites that try to do it. We're the free speech alternative to Twitter. Well, what happened with that? Gab is one example, and they literally became Nazi Central in like 2.5 minutes, and that's not hyperbole. Actual Nazis over there, neo-Nazis, whatever. So I don't agree with him on that. Now, Trump was responding to Marjorie Taylor Greene getting banned from Twitter, and he released a statement and said this: Twitter is a disgrace to democracy. They shouldn't be allowed to do business in this country. What? Marjorie Taylor Greene has a huge constituency of honest, patriotic, hardworking people. They don't deserve what's happened to them on places like low-life Twitter and Facebook. Everybody should drop off of Twitter and Facebook. They're boring, have only a radical left point of view, and are hated by everyone. They are a disgrace to our nation. Keep fighting, Marjorie. I mean, look, the important line there is they shouldn't be allowed to do business in this country. So in other words, the criticism is, hey, these guys are authoritarian, and so my response to that is, I'm going to be authoritarian and I want to ban them. They shouldn't be allowed to do business in this country. Well, that's a very China-esque response, isn't it? That's a deeply authoritarian response, isn't it? So if you believe that authoritarianism is bad, because they're banning speakers, that is an authoritarian move. You can't respond to that by saying, I'm going to be authoritarian. That's a performative contradiction, if I've ever seen one. But that's Donald Trump. When I do it, it doesn't count. When they do it, it's bad and it counts. Now, of course, he's a cuck. He would never actually pull the trigger on something like that. He was president for 4 years and he didn't. But it says a lot about the mindset, doesn't it? And when these guys yelp about free speech, we already know. They don't actually believe in free speech. They just want to be the censors. They want to be in the driver's seat. They want to be the ones determining what is allowed and what isn't allowed. I mean, we saw this with Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy. He's like, I'm doing a free speech alternative to social media, to Twitter. And he's like, and by the way, the rules are no cursing, no taking the Lord's name in vain, no pornography. And he went down a whole list of things. And it's like, well, that's not a free speech platform now, is it? And the other thing is, people pointed this out, Trump now has a financial incentive to make this point because he's starting his own social media company. And by the way, they're raising a lot of money for it too. But Trump has every reason in the world to be like, oh, Twitter's really bad and it should be banned. And come to our thing. Our thing's a lot better. So Trump wants to ban Twitter. Rand Paul is doing an exodus from big tech and he's starting with YouTube. But by the way, he does go on to say, if I ever post on these outlets again, it'll be to direct you to my new outlets or to criticize these outlets, which in a way sort of undermines the point because it's like, well, if on YouTube they're going to allow you to ruthlessly criticize YouTube, they're obviously not peak authoritarian now, are they? Because it's still a platform where you can shit on them relentlessly while you're on it, so how bad are they? Now again, that's not too compelling a point in my opinion because I do think they're very restrictive. And I haven't even gotten started on the algorithm. You guys know my whole spiel on the algorithm because I think it buries content like mine and prioritizes authoritative news like CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, and that's not fair. So really, I share some of the same criticisms, but I don't think the exodus is going to accomplish anything. And the other point that lefties were making is, oh no, conservatives, please don't leave these platforms. That would be terrible. Because if they actually do that, it's a little bit of siloing off of themselves, isn't it? Because again, the audiences are here. That's just a fact. So you can try to build it elsewhere and see if they will come, but my guess is it'll be like the other 4 or 5 attempts to, do a version of YouTube. So, but if it's your prerogative, be my guest. Hey y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.